Good afternoon, everybody. It is an absolute delight to have you with me live for the fifth webinar today, exploring independent students, developing independent learners, and looking as well at developing resilience in our young people. I will kick off in a couple of minutes' time just to allow the last few people who are able to join us live to log in and join up. And yes, we will get going in a couple of minutes' time. Obviously, any issues on the visual or any issues on the audio, please let me know and I will try and sort that out for you. For those of you who are just joining into the webinar now, we will get going in just a couple of minutes' time. We're just going to begin by giving everybody a chance to join in to today's webinar, just allow the last few people to join us live, just to maximise that and make sure we don't begin before people join us. We'll get started in about a minute's time, so if you do need to go and grab a drink or a snack, you've probably got time to do that if you're nice and quick, and we will get started in around a minute's time. Right then, a formal welcome to the fifth webinar. Thank you everybody so much for joining me live. And I know there are going to be hundreds of people who are catching up on this recording in the weeks and days that follow. So thank you so much for everybody who is taking the time to join this webinar series. It's an absolute pleasure to be able to sort of share all of this research and all of these ideas to thousands upon thousands of people, whether that is live or whether that is via the recordings. So today we are, of course, having a look at developing independent learners. And we're, of course, we're on to webinar 5 out of 6. And by Tuesday of next week, we will be finished with the live webinars. We'll have had almost 6 hours worth of live input, with me sharing theory and ideas and examples, strategies and best practice and worst practice, sharing all of that with you across the webinar series. Really, really excited for this one today. It's a little bit different, isn't it, from the other webinars? So far, we've had a look at staples of high quality teaching. We've had a look at modelling. We've had a look at questioning, and we've had a look at feedback and evaluation, things that we would be doing in every single lesson anyway, but we were taking a look at how we could adapt and amend some of the things that we were already doing to try to support our sort of pedagogical approaches and try to improve the outcomes of our lessons. Today, we're taking a slightly different tack, aren't we? And we're having a look at a problem that we're facing in schools up and down the UK, country to country. There isn't a school, I don't think, that has cracked independent learning. And I think this is especially true, isn't it, since COVID? We know that our learners are lacking resilience. We know that our learners are lacking independence. We know that our learners are needing more scaffold and more support and more spoon feeding, it sometimes feels like, than ever before. And it's not sustainable. It's not sustainable for the student who isn't able to crack on with work without us being stood over them and watching them and giving them the next piece of advice. And it isn't sustainable for us trying to produce multiple scaffolds and trying to always be there for all of our students and always give them the little bit of support they need and highlight areas of improvement. It just isn't a sustainable thing for us to be able to do. And so we need to consider the approaches. We need to consider the things that we are doing in our classrooms that develop independence in the classroom. And as we'll get onto later on in this webinar, we'll have a look at how independence and resilience itself actually tie in with metacognition, how actually the development of metacognitive skills in our learners actually does lead to improved independence and does lead to improved resilience. So that's really what we're having a look at today. As ever, and I know all of those people joining live and most of you on the recordings won't be seeing this for the first time. I really do appreciate all comments and photos and ideas that are shared on social media. It's fantastic, more so than anything, just to keep the conversation going. For those of you who are joining me, obviously, you see the power of metacognition. You know why it's important, and you're looking to further develop the things that are already happening in your classrooms. But that's not true of education as a whole, whether in the UK or outside the UK. Metacognition isn't a focus for everybody. And so actually sharing some of these ideas, sharing some of the things of what we are doing, really just helps to keep that conversation going and gets people outside our metacognitive bubble thinking about some of the things that we are doing. As ever, if you are in a position where you are able to contribute financially towards these webinars, allowing me to be able to put them on again for people, that would be absolutely fantastic. And I'm very, very appreciative of all of those people who have put contributions forward so far. In terms of contracting the sessions, very much the same. If you are joining us for the first time, you may not be aware, so let me share. You are more than welcome to pop questions and ideas into the chat function or into the question function, but it is me and myself. I am the only one hosting the webinar today, so it might be a while before I see any questions because, of course, I will be focusing in on delivery. So you're more than welcome to put questions there, and I will get to them if I can. There is going to be a little bit of time at the end of the webinar as well today for you to ask any questions. And again, on Tuesday, when we're having a look at the development of revision, there will be a little bit of time for you to consider and to share some of your questions and ideas there. However, you are, of course, more than welcome, absolutely more than welcome to drop me a message, to drop me an email, to reach out via any of my social media channels, as a lot of you are already doing. And also at the end of today's webinar, there will be a very quick survey, which will allow you, of course, to ask any questions that you may have. So before I go any further, what I want to do is I want us to think about independence. I want us to think about resilience rather than me talking at you and wanting you to consider how it might feel to be a struggling learner. So, unlike some of these other webinars where I've just talked at you for a very long time, I would love you just to think about this question for 1 minute. I'd love you to consider how you may approach this question. What is it that you are able to do? So 1 minute, and if you are on the recording, please carry on and do this activity as well. I will give you 1 minute, and then I will talk you through some of my thoughts and feelings about this question here. Right then, hopefully you've had a little bit of time to think about that question. Now, I'm really intrigued by how that actually makes you feel, because I think that if you're perhaps not a history teacher, or perhaps your recall of history is poor, or perhaps you're in a place in the world where you wouldn't have studied this, um, how you feel is quite interesting and it's very important. We may be feeling confused. We may be feeling anxious. We may not know where to begin. We might be feeling quite frustrated. We might be feeling quite angry or even quite stupid because we don't know. As an expert, as opposed to maybe the novice learner in our class, there may be some things that we're able to do. We may be able to deduce that this is to do with the interwar period. We may be able to deduce that something failed and perhaps that was a consequence as to why the Second World War began. We can also understand, can't we, the type of question this is. How far do you agree? So we're looking for evidence and statements in support of this statement here. So we're presenting our own ideas, but we need to present a strong argument for that. So there are some things that we are able to do if we don't know the content, and even if we don't know the content, there are perhaps some things that we can deduce. Because we're experts and we've done similar questions before, and we've developed a wiseness, shall we say. We've developed a sort of an intellectual base, a cognitive resilience, if we want to coin it that, around how we may tackle this question. So it may be very, very frustrating, might be quite upsetting, anxiety inducing, but maybe there's a couple of things we can do. But if we're not an expert in this area, it's going to be quite annoying. And actually, a minute is probably all we want to spend on this question because there's probably very little we could do thereafter. I now want you to consider this question. And once again, I'm going to give you a minute to think about how you would go about doing it. So again, I've given you about a minute on that question. Now, once again, the question is there to see how you feel. Here, you might be considering what on earth the question says. So, if you don't speak Welsh, you're probably going to struggle with this question. It feels, or it is in a completely different language to the one you speak. If you were to attend a lesson and a teacher started speaking in Welsh to you, it would quite literally be speaking in a foreign language. Now, the reason why I include that question there for you is because that's how a lot of students feel when we're speaking their actual first language. For a lot of students, if their first language is English and we're teaching them in English, sometimes the students may as well think that we should be speaking another language because they're so confused as to what on earth we are actually on about. So again, if I was to give you that question and you had no access to Google to maybe do a bit of Google Translate, you would really, really be struggling with this question. And again, you would be feeling perhaps a little bit stupid. You would be feeling frustrated that you just didn't understand. You'd be feeling annoyed that you just didn't know where to begin. And maybe as someone with a bit of cognitive resilience, maybe you could start to translate some of those words. Maybe you know that Gymraeg means Welsh. Maybe you can see that word at the bottom, theatre, and know that that means theatre, unsurprisingly. Technoleg, technology. So maybe there are some words that you can begin to deduce, but you're unlikely to be able to deduce enough of those words to understand the question, and certainly not enough of those words to be able to write a response in Welsh, unless, of course, you are a Welsh speaker. But again, we've got a level of cognitive resilience that we can do something, but a lot of our students don't. They would get this question and they would completely give up. Or even not this question, but very often we give them a question and they wouldn't have a clue what it's about, what on earth it's on about. And again, that's how they're feeling. They're feeling as if we're speaking a foreign language. Let me give you here the last of these tricky questions. I'm going to give you a little bit less time on this question because I think you get the point that I'm trying to make here now. So again, if we are not a maths expert, or even if we do teach maths, but maybe not up to the level of this question, it's going to be quite tricky. There's probably a lot of you sat there scratching your heads thinking, oh, this isn't actually something that I'm able to do. Maybe you could work out that third angle, but you're potentially going to struggle to work out that length. X. Perhaps your recall of trigonometry isn't there. You haven't done it for years, or perhaps you never actually learnt it in the first instance. And again, you might go, well, I could do a little bit, but I can't really do very much at all. And again, that's how our students are going to be feeling. Our students are going to be feeling frustrated once again. They're going to be feeling rubbish. They're going to feel as if they can only do a little bit, but not all of it. It is very, very dispiriting. So the point of those three questions really is to make you feel like our students may feel. They feel dispirited and annoyed and angry and infuriated that they're just not able to do the work. They feel so upset and as if we're speaking a foreign language, and they just don't know where to begin. And actually, that's how a lot of our students feel. That's the base point that we're starting with. We're trying to work with students who feel like this. So what are we actually going to do today? Well, I want us to consider the importance of metacognition in developing resilience and in developing independent learners. And then I, of course, want us to change our attention and begin to focus on the approaches that we are able to use. So again, this is going to be the last opportunity for you to pause and think before I get into speaking to you for 40 minutes. But again, an opportunity for you to reflect, and maybe you want to do this as a bit of a Venn diagram or perhaps a double bubble. I would love you to consider the characteristics that you believe an independent and a resilient learner would have. The characteristics that an independent and a resilient learner would have. So again, take a minute, take 90 seconds to note down some ideas so that you're able to reflect on your beliefs in just a second. Right then, hopefully that has been enough time for you to reflect. I think maybe not quite 90 seconds, but hopefully sufficient time there for you to reflect on what characteristics you believe independent and resilient learners would demonstrate. What characteristics would they demonstrate? What skills do they have? So buckle in. This is where I'm going to start speaking to you a lot for the next 20, 30, 40 minutes and sharing with you a lot of the research and a lot of the things that we are able to do in our classrooms. So let me share with you some of the things that I wrote down. Now, if we're doing a little bit of spot the difference, you might notice here that on the title, I have mentioned effective independent learners. Effective independent learners. There is a big difference between being independent and being an effective independent learner. And I think it is absolutely crucial that we consider this, that an individual can be independent, they can work on their own and they can chug through things, but it doesn't necessarily mean that they are working in an effective manner. So to me, and this isn't a hard and fast list, and you may have other things that you consider to be those characteristics of an independent learner, but these are just some things that I think most of us would be agreeing on. The first is that an effective independent learner would know exactly what they need to focus on. They would be aware, wouldn't they, of their areas of development. They would know that they need to be working on those things. They would also know basically what to do when they don't know what to do, when they are struggling, when they are facing issues, when they are facing cognitive strain. They would know what to do. They would consider how to plan and monitor and reach out for support. And that's that third bullet point, isn't it? If we're an effective independent learner, we are able to highlight when things are going well and equally when we need to ask for some support. And so that's that bullet point there. An effective learner will know at what point it is they need to ask for some support. An independent learner would also have effective ways to revise, and they wouldn't be revising the wrong things, and they wouldn't be revising the right things in the wrong ways. And we'll, of course, get into that more on Tuesday in the final webinar around effective revision. So that independent learner will utilize their time effectively. They're not going to be wasting time. Okay, they don't have time to waste time. They're going to be making the most of the time that is available to them. They're also going to be effective at reflection. So they're going to have a set of effective reflection strategies. So they're going to continually self-evaluate. They're going to consider how they are able to improve. They're also going to have effective planning techniques. So again, an independent learner isn't going to run headlong into things. They're going to consider the very best ways that they can do things. They're going to take the time to plan out their approaches. They're going to take the time to consider those knowledge of cognition areas. What is their knowledge of task? What is their knowledge of self? What is their knowledge of strategies? And they're going to consider that task at hand fully. They're not going to be thinking, they're not going to just answer a part of a task. They're going to take the time to look at it in its entirety and make sure that they do all the things that they need to be doing. And that brings us on to resilience. And as you might have found, and it's the reason for a Venn diagram or even a double bubble, there are significant overlaps, aren't there, between the characteristics of independence and the characteristics of resilience. So a resilient learner, they're not instantly giving up. It's not as if they see a challenge and they go, nah, I can't do that instantly. I'm just going to give up. So a little bit like in that maths challenge, perhaps a level of resilience there isn't to go, oh, I haven't a clue how to get to the end point, so I give up. It's to go, there's something that I can do. So let me at least start there, and that begins the starting point to my journey. Very much like the independence. When a resilient learner doesn't know what to do, they've got a range of strategies to at least do something. So they translate the words that they're able to. They write down a structure to a question, even if they don't know the content that they're going to include. They know what questions to ask, and they know what things to perhaps Google or look up in the textbook. A resilient learner definitely takes us towards this idea of self-regulation. You'll recall from my very first webinar that metacognition and self-regulation are different things. And self-regulation is so much more than just metacognition. but there is definitely an overlap, a slide between them. And what we often find is where there is cognitive strain and there is a need for cognitive resilience, that of course leads into self-regulation and the ability to regulate emotions and emotional responses to given tasks. So a resilient learner won't allow themselves to get completely overwhelmed, and they won't be too anxious about a challenge, about a problem that they're not instantly able to tackle. They will be able to compartmentalize and understand that these difficulties or not knowing is okay. They will know what resources to go to and how to use textbooks and how to use additional scaffolds and how to use additional adults within the room, and they will know where their support lies. I think this one is crucial. Being resilient isn't just about being able to identify that you're struggling with something. It's being able to communicate exactly what it is that is a struggle. And it's about being able to communicate exactly what it is you need support on. And we'll get to this a little bit later in one of the approaches, but I very much dislike it. It's a significant pet hate of mine, a student going, I don't know what to do. Because that in itself is not a helpful statement. Because what don't they know what to do? So it's about being able to accurately communicate what it is you are unsure about and what it is exactly that you need support on to take the next step in your learning journey. So a resilient learner as well is able to prioritize that long-term over short-term gain. They will understand that things may be difficult to begin with. They will understand that things might not be effective to start. And they will know that there is a long-term aim to all of this, that it's fine if they're not instantly hitting those outcomes that they desire, as long as they're going to be achieved in the long term. It requires resilience. Now, what do we do then? Okay, so we kind of know what a resilient learner looks like, and we know what an independent learner looks like. And you'll agree, I'm sure, with most, if not all, of those characteristics that I've identified. And you may as well, of course, have more than those that I've identified, which is absolutely fine. But how do we go about developing these things? Well, there's a number of things that we can do, and it's a range. There's not a set of 4 different things or 5 or 6 different things that we can do which instantly generates independence and resilience. It's very much across the board. In the same way that metacognition is intrinsic to large amounts of high quality teaching, it's the same with developing independence and developing resilience. So from the tasks that we use in class to the way that we communicate with parents and carers, there's a lot of different things that we can do, and we can't look at all of them. But what we can do is we can look at metacognitive approaches that we can take, that we can develop in students, which will support the metacognitive abilities of our young people, and in turn will develop their effectiveness and the effectiveness of their independence and resilience. So in effect, we're looking at developing metacognition that will support the development or the independence and the resilience in our young people. And as ever, I'm going to give you the what and the why of the strategy, and I'm going to provide you with examples from a range of different subject areas, a range of different contexts. So, the knowledge of grid. This is our first approach, and some of you may have seen this before. The knowledge of grid leans heavily, or leans exclusively, we could say, on the knowledge of cognition. Of course, the first 3 foundations in developing metacognition in our young people. So they are, of course, knowledge of task, knowledge of self, and knowledge of strategies. And you'll recall that effective planning is these 3 things being done effectively. So knowledge of task, that is effective comprehension of effective comprehension of the task that we're being given. So accurately understanding what it is that we actually have to do. That's the first step in any cognitive activity, and developing an accurate understanding of what it is we are being asked to do to ensure success in a given task. Knowledge of self is then determining the correct knowledge that needs to be incorporated in order to complete that task. So it's not about recalling every piece of information that is within that topic. It's about recalling and displaying and demonstrating the knowledge that is precise and relevant to that specific question. And lastly, we've then, of course, got our knowledge of strategies. So the different approaches that we are able to take in order to complete a task in a successful manner. And this is where effective problem solving and learner flexibility comes in. If our individual learners only have a way of doing something, they're going to lack flexibility and be weaker at problem solving than those individuals who have got strategy flexibility and have got a range of different approaches they can use and an understanding of when they should and shouldn't be using those approaches. So why would we use this sort of planning grid, which I'll share with you in a minute? It's very simple. It is 3 columns with the knowledge of task and self and strategies as headers for each of them. So it's about forcing students, kindly, of course, it's about forcing students to attend to those factors. If we're saying that those factors make up effective planning, and if we're saying that effective planning is crucial for effective outcomes, then we need to shine the spotlight on those factors. And the only way we can do that is by actually putting them at the forefront of what we're wanting students to do. So by having a planning grid that forces students to consider those areas, then we are going to have, we're going to improve those areas by placing that spotlight on them. It also allows us to place a focus on planning and not just task completion. And as I've said in some of these webinars, and as I'll keep saying, the thing that matters in learning is not the outcomes, it's the processes that we take that allow us to achieve those outcomes. Because outcomes are only as good as the process we take, and learning is only as good as the processes that we develop, the strategies that we have. So if we want really effective learners, it's that we need to shine a light on. It's the planning and the monitoring and the evaluation process, as opposed to the raw mark or the percentage or the grade that students are achieving. And so if we place a lot of time and emphasis and score and credit on planning, then that is going to have more kudos in the eyes of our students. Now, as you'll see from this activity in a minute, this planning grid provides a superb scaffold to complex tasks. And what I think we have in our learners is we do have those learners who do pause and who do consider what effective planning looks like. But we also have those students who race off. They absolutely race off. They don't even stop to wait until the end of the instruction before they begin doing it. They just start going off and they're going to make mistakes. They're not considering that process. They're just considering output. They're just considering that end goal. We also have that learner who is so concerned about what to do, they just don't really do anything. They're really lacking that resilience. So what we have overall are a lot of learners who aren't taking the time to plan out. They aren't taking the time to consider how best to do something. So this is where one of these grids comes in, and you can see simply titled knowledge of task and self and strategies. But of course, depending on our context and depending on the phase of students whom we're working with, we might want to change that language to what I have to do, what I need to include, how I'm going to do it, because that is in essence what we're doing. It's just knowledge of task and self and strategies is of course a little bit shorter. So let's take a look at this question here that I've borrowed from Corbett Maths, a superb website of maths resources. And the question read that Farmer Martin's keeping chickens in the field below. Of course he is. And each chicken is needing 3 meters squared. So what is the maximum number of chickens that he can keep? So in their planning for this question, and I think this student has actually overplanned, I think they've done too much in this grid, but it does give us an understanding of the type of information that would be incorporated. So the student understands that they're going to have to find one number, and that's the number of chickens, the total, the maximum number of chickens. The student knows that this has to be a whole number because they're talking about chickens here. It's not going to be a decimal. And if they do achieve a decimal answer, they're going to have to round down because you can't possibly have point something of a chicken. And they know that they're going to need to show their method. The student has considered that they're not very confident on finding the area for this field, but they do know that once they've found the area, if they divide it by 3 meters, they're going to find the number of chickens that can go down, and then they know that they're going to have to round down. So the student has got a high level confidence in 2 of these areas. In the third section, in knowledge of strategies, the student is considering the way in which they can chop up this shape in order to work out the area and the pros and cons of those approaches. So here, the student is clearly considering what it is they need to do, and the student is going to be in a far better position to answer this question. This student is also in a far better position to communicate to us what it is they need support on. So here, it's clear that the student is needing support on how to find out the area. That's all they need support on. So instead of a student saying, I don't know what to do, the student can say, well, I know I need to find the area of the field and then divide by 3 in order to find the number of chickens, which I will then round down because I can only have a whole number of chickens, and I'm looking for a whole number, and I know that I need to show my method. The one thing that I am unsure on is quite how to find the area. Please, could I have some support on that? What I'm thinking right now is I could split it like this, or I could split it like that. Well, wouldn't that be fantastic? Doesn't that show a huge amount of independence because they're doing something, and a huge amount of resilience because they're identifying exactly what it is they need to work on? An example here from the English classroom, so an AQA past paper question here. So a longer text studying lines 10 through 19, and the student needs to consider the language that's being used by the writer. And they need to consider words and phrases and language forms and techniques and sentence form. So the student knows that they're only needing to consider the hyena, and that's a really good narrowing of the question. They understand that it's an 8 marker, so they're going to be making 8 points. And they've considered that if there's 3 categories, they're perhaps going to mention 2 points for each, and then an extra 2 potentially after that, just to make sure that they've written enough. The student knows that they can draw out some examples from the text, and they've put a couple down. In this example, I don't have enough room to put down some of the techniques used, but the student would identify a couple there. And then students would also identify that sentence form. And the student has gone, right, they can work through each of the area, 2 points each, then a further 2 points, and they know that they need to quote from the text, but those quotes ought not be too long. So what we have here is a superb plan that's maybe taken the student 2 or 3 minutes, but all of the cognition is done now. They've identified everything that they need to write through. We, as the expert in the room, are able to give them precise feedback and highlight anything that we would maybe as an expert say, right, actually, it's 8 marks. You need to be writing 8 things, but that's not 8 separate points. It's perhaps 4 well-established points, or maybe even 3, 1 for each of those areas, but they just need to be well understood. Again here, this one's coming up, the question is coming up second. Here we go, we say, design a training program for a cross-country runner who's looking to run a marathon in 6 months. So again, the student said, right, well, it can only be 6 months. There's no point doing less, no point doing more, because that's not in the constraints of the question. They know that the individual's got a high level of starting fitness, and they know that they're going to have to build up to 26.2. So they know the outcome. And the student has deduced as a cross-country runner, they're going to have a good level of fitness to begin with. The student understands that they don't know where that athlete's starting from, and they don't, but they do know, the end point. And they also know that there might be worth putting in some sprint training there because that's an effective part of marathon training. The student has then made notes on the different ways that they could lay out the different options and different pathways, and they've concluded that they could give more than one option to show a comparison and a contrast between a couple of different ideas. So again, a longer question is very succinctly broken down and is providing students with a very strong scaffold to support them. A biology or even PE example here. Again, these slides will all be available after, and you're more than welcome to have a look through and see how this would work in different areas. And then a final example here from computing, a benefits and drawbacks type question. So you can see that perhaps where we've got cognitive resilience, something like knowledge of task or even knowledge of strategies, we could have done that maybe for the history question. We don't have any of that knowledge of self required, but we do maybe understand what we're being asked to do and potentially how we could lay something out. Similar to each of the questions, isn't it really? If we develop a level of cognitive resilience, then that knowledge of task and that knowledge of strategies begins to get a little bit easier. So we move on to the second approach, and the second approach is called goal-free problems. They originate in the maths classroom, I think, in the main. That's where goal-free problems come from. And what a goal-free problem is where we take a context question, a longer written question, and we simply get rid of the question. And the reason why we do that is because questions are limiting. Questions, by their very nature, make us focus in on a specific thing. We very rarely have a question that says, write down whatever you want about rivers. It's not a question that we typically get because it's not very narrow. Sometimes we have open-ended questions, but they're still in relation to knowledge, especially within our curriculum areas. We're always going to be channeling a question towards recall or demonstration of certain knowledge or facts rather than just open and free recall. I mean, go to a pub quiz and they don't just say write down 20 interesting pieces of trivia, do they? They're asking you 20 questions about interesting and novel pieces of trivia, and you have to see if you know them. And if you're me, you don't. And so questions are very limiting, and they prevent students from being resilient and potentially independent, because a student may automatically not know what to do, and so they shut down. If a student doesn't know the information for a question, then they can't do anything, right? That's the problem. But by removing the question itself and providing a goal-free problem where students actually have a context and a lot of different things that they are able to work out, then they can actually show off all of the things that they can do. So like I've alluded to here, this removes that barrier of a question. Students suddenly don't feel trapped. They don't feel as if they don't know anything, because actually they can demonstrate what they do know. This will improve student confidence, because suddenly a question isn't something that a student can't do. A goal-free problem is something where a student can show off everything that they do know. And that's wonderful. That's an absolutely fantastic thing for a student. And this, of course, does things like removes the limitations of absence if a student hasn't been in for whatever reason, or misunderstanding. So if a student has really, really been struggling with a topic area, then actually this provides them with a barrier reduction. It's, in essence, it's almost like a scaffold for a student. So what might this look like? Well, typically we might give this sort of question, this image, sorry, with a question which says, describe the adaptations shown by 3 animals in the photo. But actually we can just get rid of that. We can just provide students with that image, and we can say, right, what could a question be? What question might you be asked? What actually could you deduce from that image? If you're working in groups or pairs, or trios, what do you agree on? What can you come to an agreement on? Or maybe what do you disagree on? What topics do you think that this might align to? So you don't need to give those scaffolded questions on the right. You might want to give that as students get familiar with goal-free problems. But actually, we're just wanting students to write down and anything that they know in relation to that photo, and celebrate the things that students know. Whenever teachers go off and try this, after I've spoken to them about it, it leads to such high success levels, and so many successes of learning and so many celebrations of learning, as opposed to a student going, well, I don't know the adaptations of 3 animals in that photo. I don't even know what the word adaptation means, so I can't do anything. Or if I don't know 3, well, I'm not going to write about the 2 I don't know, because I'm not going to get full marks. That's what students, unfortunately, do. Again, this image might be given in a PE exam. And again, we could just provide the image to students rather than giving them a specific question. We can just see what they deduce. They might think about form, they might think about the questions that could be asked, they might think about improvements, they might think about the training program, they may think about what it's demonstrating. There's so many things. But again, we might want to give a little bit of scaffolding and say to students, well, what might this image be showing you? What follow-up questions might you be asked? What might you suggest? Again, world map, maybe we're thinking about time zones. Rather than saying to a student, well, it's 2 p.m. in the UK, find out the time in every other country, students can start where they want. They can use whatever method they want. What do you know? What are you able to calculate? What do you agree on within your pairs, your trios, your groups? Again, an image about different religions. What do students know? What buildings do they see? What religions do they link to? What do they know about those different religions? Why are there 6 images or sort of 6 religious buildings on the earth? Why are they there? Rather than saying, name those 6 buildings, and a student might freak out because they only know 2 or 3 or 4. Actually, we're seeing what students do know. And this actually gives us a lot of insight, doesn't it, to what students are able to recall and what they're struggling to recall. So this is a fantastic thing as well. It gives us more information and allows us to assess our students far, far better. Now, one of the things that I quite like to have a rant about is the use of a scaffold. Scaffolds are brilliant. Absolutely brilliant, because a scaffold takes a student from here, where they currently are, up to here, where we really want them to be. And that is, of course, fantastic. Absolutely brilliant. But let us consider the process of providing a student with a scaffold. Okay, let's consider the process of providing a student with a scaffold. So we go over to the student. Okay, we go over to the student, and we see what it is they're doing, and we have a look at their work, we review their work, and as a subject expert, we are able to deduce what it is they really need to work on. And based upon that, the mistake or the next step to improve, we then go into our brain of different scaffolds and we pull out the scaffold that is most suitable for the student, and then we provide it to them, and suddenly go from here up to here, and that's absolutely superb. But now consider the student. The student is sat there. They see you leaning over their shoulder and reviewing their work, and then suddenly a dictionary or a periodic table or a calculator appears out of nowhere, and we say, right, use this. This is going to help you. And it does. The student improves, but the process hasn't necessarily improved because the student doesn't understand several things. They haven't understood the metacognition that you have gone through as the expert. We as the expert, using our subject knowledge, can see the issue that has cropped up. Okay, we can see the issue that has cropped up. And we need to share that with the student. We need to say, right, what I'm seeing here is, and the reason I know that this isn't quite right is. Now, when you see this issue, stop, because it needs to be corrected. Now, when we've got this type of issue, issue X, what I would go and get is a dictionary, writing grid, keyword bank, insert scaffold here. I would go and get a. The reason I would get this scaffold is because the way that we use this scaffold is. Now go and use it. And so the student still makes the same progress, but suddenly the student is able to diagnose the issue. They can spot that issue, and they know to stop, and they know how to improve. Okay, they know how to improve. And they can then take control and become more independent in their learning. They'll be more resilient because they know what scaffolds to go and get and when they should be using them and how to use them. So it's a wonderful thing to take the time. So I've talked through all of those bullets that have just come up on the screen. So in effect, we already give scaffolds all the time, but though that's a truly metacognitive moment, we're not taking the time necessarily to actually explain that metacognition to our young people. And this becomes a fantastic strategy for our classroom teachers, but it's also fantastic for our teaching support, our teaching assistants, to ensure that they are giving that little metacognitive boost to the learners in the classroom as well. I've just put some examples there of scaffolds, but of course there are dozens and dozens of different things that we will use across our different subject areas, across our phases, and across our contexts. Now, the last thing that I'm going to come to is intriguing. It's limited questions, and though that feels counterintuitive, what I would suggest is that typically we reduce the number of questions that students are allowed to ask. Now, I potentially need to rephrase this. I need to caveat this because it isn't just a case of saying, right, you're allowed one question only, otherwise you've got to struggle manfully on your own. That's not helpful. Of course, that's not helpful. So rather than students just constantly saying, I don't know, I'm stuck, help, none of those things are particularly helpful. So we either need to limit the questions because they're not particularly helpful, or students are able to ask very precise questions because they've considered exactly what it is they need to work on, potentially through identification of those factors through things like that knowledge of grid. Or we can get students to ask metacognitively focused questions. Right, I'd really like some knowledge, and I'd really like some support on this knowledge of strategies. How can I go about doing this task? I'd really like some support on monitoring. I'm just not sure if I should be using this checklist, if I've got everything, if this is the right way of laying it out. Please, could you give me some support on the layout? This is what I'm thinking. So it's about understanding what the student is thinking and about getting them to isolate the next thing that they want support on. Because independence and resilience comes from asking the right question about the correct next step, about the thing that you really need to know. A student perhaps struggling on that maths question that we looked at right at the beginning, if they didn't know how to work out the third angle in that triangle, the question they need to be asking is, well, please could you help me understand what angles in a triangle need to add up to? That's the first piece of information they need. What they don't need is the sine formula to be able to work out the length x. Okay, that's not helpful. It's something that they don't know, but it isn't the next thing that they need to understand in order to make progress. And so limited questions allows us to focus in on what a student is struggling with. So it allows a spotlight to be placed on that isolated factor, or it ensures that students are asking metacognitive questions. So it's forcing students actually to consider that knowledge of self and questions to be more precise and task and strategy related. And I think that final bullet point really summarizes everything I've said there, doesn't it? Students are developing independence because they are looking at the next step and not the final solution. So an example, students would ask the question, how many dates do I need to include to get full marks? Rather than saying, what do I need to do? And actually, when a student asks that question, we can say, well, how many do you think and why? And then we can give some helpful feedback. A student will say, well, what is the next stage in this strategy? Not, I don't know how this works. So a student would go, right, well, I'm using this strategy because, and I've done step 1 and step 2. I can't recall what step 3 is. Please, can you help me with the recall there? A student wouldn't go, oh, how do I plan? But as an expert, what planning method would you be using? This is what I think, but what would you be using? A student would go, am I showing methods? They go, right, well, how much of my methods do I need? How much depth am I required to put into this? There are, of course, many other things we can do, but in effect, it's about getting students to ask precise questions about precise next steps, focusing on the process as opposed to the outcomes. Now, one question I always get is, well, doesn't this mean that teachers are working harder and students aren't? You know, here we've got to do this. There's 4 things I've mentioned amongst, above and beyond everything else we're already doing. Aren't we doing more and the students in many ways doing less? Well, let's consider this approach. To begin with, we need to be implementing these strategies. Okay, that's what we begin with. We consider which of these 4 things we want to kick off with, or whether we're going to kick off with all 4, or other things we've seen maybe in these other webinars, things that we want to go ahead and try. Now, as a consequence of utilizing these strategies, and that's not me saying that it isn't going to lead to a little bit more work, but as a consequence of utilizing some of these strategies, students will begin to be more independent. They're going to be more effective. They're not going to instantly give up, because their resilience will improve and their study skills will improve and they're going to become more efficient and effective. So by virtue of us doing something, they will get better, and that's the self-sustaining thing. This input from us doesn't need to remain at the same levels forever, because we're developing skills. Students will better be able to take control of their learning. So, as ever, we have got the survey and a reminder of social media links at the end. Please do feel free to give me a follow. Please do drop me any messages that you want. And as ever, if you are able to fill in the survey, it would be very, very much appreciated. We are now down to our final webinar. We've got one final one. This final one is probably only going to be about 30 minutes long, just because it's drawing on a number of ideas from the other 5 webinars, and it's drawing a lot of different things together. So that one is probably going to be around half an hour to 40 minutes in length. And that one will be exploring developing effective revision skills and what it really means to be effective in our revision. And it's going to draw on some of the same work that we looked at in the last webinar a couple of days ago around feedback and evaluation, but we are going to be considering how we support effective revision development and have a look at some of the things that we can do across school. For now, I'm going to leave you on this slide. Please do reach out to me with any questions. And of course, if you do have a question, do feel free to pop it into the chat right now. Do feel free to ask it on the survey. I will be having a look at those over the weekend as well. I really, really look forward to hearing from you. Can I thank you once again for joining me today, either live or on the recording? I do hope that you got a lot out of today, maybe some new strategies, maybe a realization of how students can feel in our subject, an alien language, things that they just cannot recall, not knowing where to begin with a problem. Hopefully that made you feel uncomfortable and frustrated and upset, because, well, in the nicest possible way, because that's how our young people feel. Some of the time, all of the time, okay? A lot of our learners can feel like that. So hopefully it was good to reflect on some of those things, and hopefully you have got some approaches that will help support you moving forwards. It's been a delight as ever. If I can help you whatsoever with anything in your metacognitive journeys, then I am simply a click away. Thank you ever so much, and I look forward to seeing you all on Tuesday. Do take care and have a lovely weekend. Thank you, everybody. Thank you.